Hey guys, welcome back. Although I spend most of my time these days enjoying slow living and fresh air, I wanted to stop by quickly to update a few things that we've changed this year regarding our drip irrigation system. A few years ago, I did a video on our drip irrigation system and step-by-step how we installed ours, which was super easy. Today, I'm doing an updated video because since drip irrigation has become so popular in the gardening world, thankfully, a few more odds and ends have come out that I think are better suited to at least our gardening situation, and I'm sure somebody else is out there too. If you haven't already watched the other video, I recommend watching that one first. It's basically a drip irrigation step-by-step explaining the major parts and players and how they all fit together. Interestingly, most of those are actually still the same for this video. I'm just going to be talking about a few pieces that are now popular and I think work a little bit better than what we used in the past. In that other video, I explained the different types of tubing and where they are used. And I use the analogy of kind of like a highway and side roads. So this 1/2-inch distribution tubing is what I consider kind of the highway of water. It carries a ton of water out to main areas that you are trying to irrigate. And then in that video, what we did was we used what is called drip tape. We attached that to the distribution tubing, and then I kind of use the analogy of side roads for the drip tape. These are the ones that come off the highway and onto the garden beds where the crops are actually growing. However, I found something that I actually am enjoying a little bit more than the drip tape. When we purchased the drip tape, it had some mixed reviews and it honestly worked fine for us. But since it's thinner than the distribution tubing, I don't think it typically lasts more than a couple or a few seasons. To give you an idea, after 3 years, our drip tape is probably about 50% incapacitated. So we have about 50% that is still working, and then about 50% that we had to replace with either more drip tape or this alternative, which I'll talk about in just a second. And I think the reason for that is because it's a little bit thinner than the distribution tubing, and the sun is beating down on it during the summer, the elements throughout the rest of the year. And you can't actually leave it down all the time. I do have to take it up periodically to weed and to just clean out the garden beds at the end or the beginning of the season. So they do end up taking a bit of a beating and they don't last forever. What I ended up trying this year and actually ended up really liking is this 1/4-inch distribution tubing. So it is obviously much smaller than the 1/2-inch, so it doesn't carry as much water with it. However, I use this as kind of those side roads instead of the drip tape. What I like to use is this 1/4-inch tubing to each plant or to each garden bed. Now, obviously, the 1/4-inch tubing does not have the kind of evenly distributed holes like the drip tape does for emitting the actual water. So I will explain the two different ways that we get the water to the crops. One way is with drip emitters. Now, one of the cool things is that since I made that last video, there are so many more drip emitters to choose from now than there were when I made that first video a few years ago. So I will link a few of my favorites below, but I think they have gone up in quality and there are just so many more options depending on what you're looking for. You're bound to find just what you need. So here are a few that I used. Emitters will emit a certain amount of water, obviously. Some of them are a set amount of water, such as 1 gallon an hour or 2 gallons an hour or a 1/2 gallon an hour. But something that's cool is now they have all these emitters that are actually adjustable. And it can kind of be a pro and a con. It's a pro if you're not super particular about the exact amount of water that your crops are getting. If you're just kind of a hobbyist like I am, then I do prefer these because we just provide ample drainage wherever we plant, and then we don't have to worry about overwatering. However, if you're more of a professional or market gardener, you might be more interested in really high quality emitters that deliver the exact amount of water that the plants need, so that you're getting harvests at the exact right time and all that. But for the sake of the video, I'm going to assume that most of us are hobbyists, and I do really like the adjustable ones. They're easy to buy in bulk, but they do also just have kind of the standard 1 gallon, 1/2 gallon, 2 gallon per hour, etc. Now, in order to attach the 1/4-inch tubing to the 1/2-inch tubing, I use these little pieces here. There, again, are all sorts of different versions on the internet. I will link the ones that I liked. We have tried a few, and I do really like these ones that have the barb, and they also have kind of the screw-on part that keeps everything really locked in place really well. We like our system totally automated. We don't like to have to think about it at all, so it can be pretty disheartening. Some of the barbed fittings, when the pressure is high enough, it'll sort of shoot it off accidentally. So I do really like having these extra twists to keep it really firmly on there. So what I did is I just cut the 1/2-inch distribution tubing. I added these T's on. So as you can see, each end of the tubing goes into each side, and then the 1/4-inch tubing just goes on the little 1/4-inch attachments here. One note is I will link the distribution tubing that I liked. I'm not going to say any names, but we did buy the 1/2-inch distribution tubing from a major big box store retailer, and it was awful. The measurements were not actually accurate, so a lot of these T's they were such a pain to get in there because the tubing was actually too bigger than it was supposed to be. So I will link the distribution tubing that I really like, both the 1/4-inch and the 1/2-inch. Once I got all the T's on into the appropriate places, then I attached the much smaller 1/4-inch tubing. When I'm going to crops that are evenly spaced, it's obviously no big deal. We just sort of roughly measure the 1/4-inch tubing from the T to the plant. And then we just place a single emitter there, and it's all taken care of. Side note, I always recommend after you do some work on the irrigation system, turning on the irrigation and checking everything to make sure there are no leaks or none of your emitters are on like a super high setting that you weren't prepared for or anything. So definitely recommend that. And then we just did this to each plant. So here we have grow bags with all of our kind of cucurbits. We have pumpkins, honeydew, cantaloupe, watermelons, that sort of deal. I think those are cucurbits, right? I'm not sure if there's a better category for that. Squash, that kind of thing. So everybody's got ample drainage and getting roughly the same amount of water. There is a situation in which I do actually still prefer the drip tape, and I will go into what that is exactly. But for now, let's talk about the scenarios where I prefer the 1/4-inch and why. Okay, now I'm going to tell you about the garden beds where I prefer the 1/4-inch tubing and the special emitters that are so fun, I think. So here we have emitters that act like little tiny sprinklers. There are also some you can get that act more like misters, and there are some that just spray different water patterns. So I will link a bunch of those for you below. But these are the ones that we chose, and it is working pretty darn well. Now, the situation I mentioned before where I actually still do prefer a line of drip tape, that's anywhere where I have a row of crops. So the way that our garden is designed, that's kind of how I have my tomatoes and nightshades. That's how I have my cucumbers. That's how I have my peas and my beans. I just sort of have a single row. Things that I don't like to use that drip tape for are things that I'm going to direct seed in a large amount. So especially ones with staggered plantings. So for example, radishes, arugula, some cabbages, some celery, anything that I'm just sort of going to disturb some soil and throw some seeds on and disturb the soil again to get them covered up. That's where I prefer to use these sprinkler emitters. The reason I don't like to use the drip tape in those situations is because they just cover quite a bit of surface area, which is going to be all spots where the seeds can't grow into delicious crops. And these garden beds really should they have 3 rows of drip tape, but they really should have 4 probably to have that even distribution of water. Now you might be thinking, well, why don't you just plant those crops like radishes and beets and arugula and spinach? Why don't you just plant it in rows so that you can use the drip tape? And the reason is because I'm just not that organized. For these crops that do best with staggered planting, I actually prefer a little bit more of like a chaos gardening method where you just sort of throw seeds down and then you harvest what comes up when it's ready. So I don't like to do big harvests with these at once. I just sort of keep everything growing as best I can all season, and I just pick it when it looks ready. So for example, radishes, I'll plant a bunch of radishes, and then when they're ready, I'll pull them up. There will still be plenty that aren't quite ready yet, but wherever I pulled up some radishes, I'll just throw some more seeds down. So because there's no real design, no real rows in this method, I really actually do prefer these sort of sprinkler emitters because they cover a lot more surface area than those drip emitters. They do use a little more water. So if you are in an area that is super dry or needs to be super conservative with water, you might want to consider something like the drip tape still. But for us, this tiny little extra bit of distance between the soil and the emitter compared to the drip tape, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. So we're not going to worry about that. Like I mentioned, this is kind of an express updated version of the video I posted before. If you're looking for a really clear drip irrigation from the hose bib to the crops, I do recommend just watching that other video. I walk through everything on there. And if you're looking for an update on that piece that sort of has all the little complicated parts in one, I think it got some mixed reviews online, but our update, this isn't sponsored or anything, but for us, we haven't had any issues since we ordered that one years ago. And in fact, it's worked so well that we did order another one for a new gardening zone that we added. And so far, both are still working fine. So I can't speak for everybody, but that's the one that we like to use. So that's about it. Please leave a comment with any drip irrigation design or installation tips that you've learned along the way. Otherwise, thanks for watching today, and we'll see you next time.